The sound of a slap echoed through the hospital hallway, sharp and sudden, and for one full second, nobody moved. Jasmine Carter's hand flew to her cheek, her eyes wide with shock, her 7 months pregnant belly trembling as her whole body swayed from the force of the blow. Patients in wheelchairs stopped breathing. Nurses froze mid-step. A janitor dropped his mop. And in the center of it all stood Marcus Blackwell, billionaire, immaculate in his tailored suit, smiling like he had just won an argument instead of committing an assault. "Now you'll remember who I am," he said coldly, adjusting his cufflink as if nothing had happened, as if the woman in front of him wasn't shaking, wasn't pregnant, wasn't a human being who had simply told him no. Jasmine's vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall in front of him. Her hand still pressed against her stinging cheek, she felt the baby kick inside her, hard, as though even her unborn child sensed the injustice of the moment. The hallway was silent except for the distant beeping of monitors and the soft gasp of a young mother holding her toddler near the nurse's station. Marcus turned and walked away, his shoes clicking against the polished floor with the confidence of a man who had never once faced consequences in his life. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. In his mind, this was already over, a forgettable inconvenience, a nurse who would learn her place. But what Marcus Blackwell did not know, what he could not have possibly imagined as he stepped into his private elevator and straightened his tie, was that the woman he had just struck in front of a hallway full of witnesses had a brother. And that brother was about to change everything. 3 hours before the slap, Jasmine's shift had started like any other. She arrived at the hospital before sunrise, her badge clipped to her scrubs, her swollen feet already protesting the 12-hour shift ahead of her. She was due in less than 2 months, and her co-workers often asked why she hadn't taken leave yet. Her answer was always the same, soft and certain. "My patients need me, and so does my paycheck." She rubbed her belly gently as she walked the corridor, greeting an elderly patient by name, adjusting a blanket for a man recovering from surgery, and pausing to comfort a frightened teenager waiting for test results. This was who Jasmine was, steady, warm, and endlessly patient, even when her own body begged for rest. By mid-morning, the private wing of the hospital buzzed with unusual tension. Word had spread that a wealthy donor's associate was visiting a patient, and hospital administration wanted everything to run flawlessly. Jasmine paid little attention to the gossip. She had patients of her own to care for, and titles meant nothing to her when someone was in pain. She moved from room to room with quiet efficiency, checking vitals, adjusting medication schedules, and reassuring a nervous new father whose wife had just given birth. She had no idea that across the hospital, a man named Marcus Blackwell was growing increasingly irritated that the world was not bending to his schedule. Marcus had arrived to see a business associate recovering from a minor procedure, but he had grown impatient waiting for visiting hours to officially begin. He wanted an immediately, rules be damned, and he expected someone to simply make it happen, the way people always did when his name was mentioned. When the front desk staff explained that visiting policy applied to everyone regardless of status, Marcus's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowed, and a dangerous, unfamiliar feeling crept into his chest. The feeling of being told no. He was not used to it, and he was about to take that frustration out on the first person who dared to stand firm. That person was Jasmine. She had been called to the visitor's desk to help de-escalate the situation, her supervisor hoping that her calm demeanor might smooth things over. When she arrived, Marcus was mid-sentence, listing his accomplishments to a frazzled receptionist as though wealth were a magic password that unlocked every door. Jasmine listened politely, then explained, gently but firmly, that hospital policy existed to protect patients recovering from anesthesia, and that visiting hours would begin in 40 minutes regardless of who was asking. It was a simple, professional answer, the kind she had given dozens of times to dozens of impatient visitors. But Marcus did not hear a policy. He heard defiance. He stepped closer to Jasmine, towering over her, his voice rising as he demanded she make an exception, the way everyone always did for him. Jasmine, steady despite the tightening in her chest, repeated that she could not break the rules, not for him, not for anyone, and that his associate's safety mattered more than his convenience. She kept her tone respectful even as something cold and threatening flickered across Marcus's face, a a warning sign she had seen before in difficult patients' families, but never quite like this. "You have no idea who you're talking to," Marcus hissed, his voice low enough that only she could hear it, his finger pointing inches from her face. Jasmine felt her heart pound, not from fear of him, but from the protective instinct rising in her chest for the baby she carried. She placed a steadying hand on her belly and took a small step back, choosing composure over confrontation. She did not know, in that moment, that her calm refusal had wounded Marcus's ego in a way few things ever had, and that his wounded pride was about to explode into something the entire hospital would never forget. The hallway outside the private wing had filled with onlookers by the time Marcus's anger reached its peak. Visitors, off-duty staff, even a security guard had gathered, drawn by the rising volume of his voice. Jasmine, sensing the situation needed someone with more authority, asked Marcus calmly to please lower his voice and wait the remaining minutes like everyone else. It was a reasonable request, the kind any professional would make. But to Marcus Blackwell, a man who had spent decades surrounded by people who said yes, it felt like the final insult. His hand moved before his mind caught up to it. The slap landed across Jasmine's cheek with a force that snapped her head sideways, her hand instinctively flying to protect her stomach rather than her face. Gasps rippled through the hallway. A nurse screamed. An elderly visitor nearly dropped his cane in shock. Jasmine stood frozen for a moment, her ears ringing, her cheek burning, disbelief washing over her in waves as she realized what had just happened, in public, in front of patients, in front of children, in front of God and everyone. Marcus straightened his jacket, glanced around at the stunned faces, and to the horror of everyone watching, he smiled. Not a flicker of guilt crossed his face. Only the satisfaction of a man who believed he had reasserted control. "She'll be fine," he said dismissively to no one in particular, before turning to leave as though he had merely brushed past someone in a crowded room. He did not see the security guard already reaching for his radio. He did not see the trembling rage building in the eyes of nurses who loved Jasmine like family. And he certainly did not see the phone call that was about to be made. A call that would reach a man whose name Marcus would soon wish he had never crossed. Jasmine was guided to a private room moments after the slap, her hands shaking, her breathing shallow as a colleague checked her pulse and her baby's heartbeat with trembling hands of her own. The on-call doctor confirmed the baby was stable, but Jasmine's emotions were anything but. She sat on the edge of the exam table, staring at the wall, replaying the moment over and over. The sting on her cheek nothing compared to the humiliation that burned inside her chest. She had spent years building a reputation as a calm, dependable nurse, and in one instant, in front of dozens of witnesses, she had been reduced to a headline. Within the hour, hospital administration had already begun making calls, not to support Jasmine, but to manage what they saw as a public relations problem. The hospital's director, a nervous man named Philip Donnelly, paced his office anxiously, aware that Marcus Blackwell's family foundation had donated heavily to the hospital's new wing. He worried more about losing funding than about the young pregnant nurse who had just been struck in his hallway. When Jasmine was called into his office later that day, she expected comfort. Instead, she received a carefully worded suggestion that she consider how the situation might be misinterpreted if she pursued it further. Jasmine left that meeting feeling more bruised than she had after the slap itself. She walked to her car in the parking garage, sat behind the wheel, and finally allowed herself to cry, her hands resting protectively on her belly as sobs shook her small frame. She thought of her son, due in just 2 months, and made a silent vow that she would not let this defeat her, even if the people who were supposed to protect her seemed determined to look the other way. What she didn't know was that someone else had already heard what happened, someone who would never, ever let this slide. Darius Carter received the phone call while sitting in a quiet, nondescript office that gave no hint of who he truly was. The voice on the other end belonged to a hospital co-worker of Jasmine's, a woman named Renee who had grown close to Jasmine over the years and who happened to have Darius's number from a family emergency months earlier. Renee's voice trembled as she described what she'd witnessed, the arrogance, the slap, the smile Marcus wore as he walked away. Darius listened in silence, his jaw tightening, his fingers curling slowly into a fist on the desk in front of him. To most people who knew him casually, Darius Carter was simply Jasmine's older brother, a private man who worked in consulting and traveled often, rarely discussing the details of his career. He had always been protective of his younger sister, ever since their parents passed when Jasmine was still in nursing school, leaving him to step into a role he never asked for but accepted without hesitation. He had watched her work tirelessly to build a life of dignity and purpose, and he had promised himself long ago that no one would ever be allowed to hurt her without consequence. Today, that promise had been tested in the worst possible way. Darius closed his laptop, stood up from his desk, and looked out the window for a long, quiet moment, his expression unreadable to anyone who might have walked in. Then he picked up his phone again and made a single call, his voice calm but edged with a coldness that would have unsettled anyone who knew what he was truly capable of. "I need everything on a man named Marcus Blackwell," he said. "Everything. And I need it by tonight." On the other end of that call was someone Marcus Blackwell would soon learn to fear far more than any lawsuit or scandal. Because Darius Carter was not just a brother seeking justice. He was something else entirely, something the world would soon discover. News of the incident spread through the hospital like wildfire, though the official story being whispered in break rooms was carefully different from what truly happened. By the next morning, a sanitized version had taken shape, one in which Jasmine had become confrontational with a valued guest and Marcus had merely reacted defensively. Jasmine heard the rumor secondhand from a junior nurse who looked at her with pity rather than anger, and the unfairness of it hit her like a second slap, this one invisible but just as painful. She wanted to scream, to correct every twisted word, but exhaustion and grief made it hard to even speak. Marcus, meanwhile, had returned to his penthouse office without a single thought about the woman he had struck. He spent the morning in back-to-back calls, barking instructions to assistants, signing off on acquisitions, behaving as though the previous day had never happened. When his assistant nervously mentioned that hospital staff seemed unusually tense, Marcus waved it off with a short laugh. "People get over things," he said, scrolling through his phone. "Money has a way of helping them forget." He had no idea that somewhere in the city, a quiet, methodical investigation into his entire life had already begun. That evening, Jasmine sat alone in her apartment, staring at her phone, debating whether to call her brother. She hated burdening him with her problems. He always seemed to carry enough weight of his own, even though she'd never fully understood what that weight was. When she finally dialed his number, her voice cracked the moment he answered, and she told him everything: the slap, the smiling walk away, the hospital's cold dismissal. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and then Darius said only 6 words that sent a chill down her spine. "He doesn't know who you are." Jasmine pressed her brother for an explanation, but Darius remained vague, telling her only to stay strong, document everything, and let him handle the rest. It wasn't the first time he had spoken to her this way, calm, controlled, slightly distant when it came to his own affairs. But tonight there was a new intensity in his voice that unsettled her. She wanted to ask more, but exhaustion pulled at her, and the baby's restless kicking reminded her she needed to rest for both their sakes. She hung up feeling slightly comforted, though she couldn't shake the feeling that something larger was unfolding just beyond her understanding. The next morning, Philip Donnelly arrived at his office to find an unfamiliar man waiting outside his door, dressed simply but carrying himself with unmistakable authority. The man introduced himself only as a representative of the Carter family and asked, politely but firmly, for a complete copy of the incident report, the visitor logs, and security footage from the hallway where Jasmine had been struck. Donnelly, sensing something far more serious than he'd anticipated, stammered through an excuse about needing time to review the request internally. The man simply nodded, said he understood, and left a card on the desk before walking away without another word. That same afternoon, Marcus's assistant burst into his office, pale and visibly shaken, holding her phone with trembling hands. "Sir," she said carefully, "there's something you need to see." On the screen was a grainy but unmistakable video, recorded by a bystander's phone, showing the slap in full, undeniable clarity. Marcus's raised hand, Jasmine's stunned face, his arrogant smile as he walked away. It had already been shared thousands of times overnight, and the captions accompanying it were not kind. For the first time in years, Marcus Blackwell felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest. The cold grip of consequences finally catching up to him. The video spread faster than anyone could control. Strangers across the country who had never met Jasmine or Marcus found themselves furious on her behalf, flooding comment sections with outrage, sharing the clip with captions condemning the billionaire's cruelty. News outlets picked up the story within hours, drawn by the irresistible contrast between obscene wealth and casual violence against a pregnant healthcare worker. Marcus's publicist called him in a panic, urging him to issue a statement immediately, but Marcus, still clinging to old habits of control, insisted that this will blow over like everything else. It did not blow over. Sponsors who had quietly funded several of Marcus's business ventures began reaching out with concerned, carefully worded emails. A major partner threatened to pull out of an upcoming deal unless Marcus addressed the incident publicly. For the first time in his adult life, Marcus felt the uncomfortable sensation of his name working against him instead of opening doors. Still, his pride refused to let him apologize. Instead, he instructed his legal team to prepare a statement framing the encounter as a misunderstanding and hinting that Jasmine had been the aggressor, a calculated lie meant to protect his image at her expense. Jasmine learned about the statement from a friend who sent her the article with a single heartbroken message. "I'm so sorry, this isn't right." Reading Marcus's words, watching him twist the truth so casually, broke something deep inside her that the slap itself had not. She felt tears blur her vision as she read the comments beneath the article, some defending her, others cruelly questioning her version of events simply because Marcus had more money and a louder platform. She closed her laptop, pressed both hands over her belly, and whispered softly to her unborn son, "I won't let them erase what happened to us." She did not yet know that her brother had already set something irreversible into motion. Darius arrived at Jasmine's apartment that evening, something he rarely did during work hours, and the moment she opened the door and saw his face, she knew he had learned something important. He sat her down gently, made her a cup of tea despite her insistence that she was fine, and finally began to explain, in careful, measured words, more about what he actually did for a living. He told her that for years he had worked in corporate intelligence and crisis investigation, specializing in uncovering the hidden financial and ethical violations of powerful individuals and corporations. Work that required absolute discretion, which was why he had never spoken of it in detail. Jasmine listened in stunned silence as her brother explained that Marcus Blackwell's company had already been quietly flagged months earlier for irregular financial practices, though no formal investigation had been launched yet due to political and financial protection surrounding him. Darius had been one of several specialists privately approached to determine whether sufficient evidence existed to pursue accountability. The attack on Jasmine, horrifying as it was, had inadvertently placed Marcus directly in the path of someone who already possessed the skills, resources, and motivation to dismantle the protective walls he believed were untouchable. "This isn't about revenge," Darius said softly, taking his sister's hand in his. "It's about making sure he never gets to do this to anyone else again, and making sure the people who tried to protect him because of his money learn that protecting cruelty has a cost too." Jasmine felt a mixture of fear and fierce gratitude wash over her, realizing for the first time just how much her brother had quietly carried, and how much he was now prepared to risk to make things right. What she still did not know was that the deeper Darius dug, the more shocking truths he would uncover. Secrets that stretched far beyond one slap in a hospital hallway. While Darius worked quietly behind the scenes, the hospital's internal politics grew tense and chaotic. Philip Donnelly, increasingly nervous about the viral attention, called an emergency meeting with the hospital board, hoping to find a way to minimize damage without admitting fault. During the meeting, one detail emerged that shifted the entire room's mood. The hospital's own security footage, the very footage Donnelly had hoped to quietly bury, had already been subpoenaed by an outside legal team representing Jasmine, a team Jasmine herself had not hired. Confused and unsettled, Donnelly demanded to know who was funding this sudden, aggressive legal action on behalf of a single nurse. His assistant, after a hurried investigation, returned with an answer that drained the color from his face. The legal team had been retained anonymously, fully paid, with resources that suggested access to extraordinary wealth and influence. Whoever was protecting Jasmine Carter was not simply a concerned family member with savings to spend. They were someone with the kind of financial power that made hospital boards and billion-dollar companies nervous. Meanwhile, Marcus's own legal advisors were growing uneasy as well. Routine background checks initiated as a defensive measure had turned up an unsettling pattern. Every attempt to discredit Jasmine quietly online seemed to be met almost immediately with calm, devastating rebuttals from anonymous but extremely well-informed sources. It was as if someone somewhere was watching every move Marcus made and responding instantly and precisely. Marcus brushed off his lawyer's warnings with his usual arrogance, insisting it was simply public sympathy for a pregnant woman. He had no idea that the precision he was witnessing wasn't sympathy at all. It was strategy, and it was just getting started. As pressure mounted publicly, an old wound resurfaced privately within the Carter family. Jasmine's cousin, Patrice, who had always harbored quiet jealousy over the close bond between Jasmine and Darius, saw an opportunity in the chaos. Patrice had struggled financially for years, and as reporters began circling the family for comments, she agreed to a paid interview with a tabloid, painting a distorted picture of Jasmine's personal life, hinting at family dysfunction and implying that Jasmine wasn't as innocent as she seemed. The betrayal cut deep, not because the public believed it entirely, but because it came from someone Jasmine had once trusted completely. When Jasmine saw the interview, she felt a different kind of pain than anything Marcus had caused, the ache of family betrayal layered on top of public humiliation. She called Patrice in tears, asking why she would do something so cruel during the hardest moment of her life. Patrice, ashamed but unwilling to back down, mumbled something about needing the money and feeling overlooked for years, while everyone focused on Jasmine's struggles and Darius's mysterious success. The call ended in heartbreak on both sides, leaving Jasmine to grieve a relationship she hadn't realized was so fragile. Darius, upon learning of the interview, felt a fresh wave of anger, not just at Marcus anymore, but at the fractures within his own family that wealth and jealousy had quietly carved over the years. Still, he resisted the urge to retaliate against Patrice harshly, choosing instead to have a private, firm conversation with her about consequences and family loyalty. He understood envy better than most people realized, having watched it shape so much of his professional world. But this new betrayal also reminded him of something he had buried for years. A secret about his own past with Marcus Blackwell that he had never shared with Jasmine, one that was about to become impossible to hide any longer. The secret Darius carried stretched back nearly a decade, to a time before he became the discreet, formidable man Jasmine knew today. In his early career, Darius had briefly worked as a junior analyst at a financial firm that Marcus Blackwell's father had once controlled. During that time, Darius had discovered evidence of fraudulent accounting practices being used to inflate the company's value before a major acquisition. Practices that benefited the Blackwell family enormously while quietly devastating smaller investors who trusted them. Young and idealistic, Darius had tried to report it internally, only to be quietly pushed out of the company and threatened into silence through a carefully worded non-disclosure agreement. That betrayal had changed the course of Darius's life entirely, pushing him away from traditional corporate paths and into the shadowy, specialized world of corporate accountability work, where he built a reputation for uncovering exactly the kind of corruption that had once cost him his early career and his faith in powerful institutions. He never told Jasmine the full story, partly out of shame for how powerless he'd felt at the time, and partly to protect her from a world he hoped she would never have to navigate. He had no idea, until recently, that the very same family responsible for that early injustice had now circled back into their lives through Marcus. When Darius finally pieced together that Marcus Blackwell was not simply a random arrogant billionaire, but the son of the very man who had silenced him years earlier, something cold and resolute settled deep in his chest. This was no longer just about defending his sister from a single act of violence. This was about closing a chapter of injustice that had haunted him quietly for 10 years, one that had unknowingly shaped the very skills he would now use to ensure that neither Marcus nor his family's legacy of cruelty would walk away unscathed again. Marcus, increasingly rattled by the layers of resistance forming against him, decided to take matters into his own hands rather than rely solely on his legal team. He arranged what he believed would be a quiet, private meeting with Jasmine, hoping a personal apology and a generous financial settlement might end the controversy before it spiraled further out of control. He chose a quiet cafe, away from cameras, confident that his charm and money could smooth over what his temper had broken. Jasmine, against her better judgment but desperate for closure, agreed to meet him, with Darius insisting on waiting just outside, unseen but ready. When Marcus arrived, he wore an expression of practiced humility, the kind he'd clearly rehearsed in front of a mirror. He offered Jasmine an apology that sounded more like a business transaction than genuine remorse, sliding a folder across the table containing a settlement offer with more zeros than Jasmine had ever seen in her life. "This can all go away quietly," he said, his tone almost gentle, as though he were doing her a favor. "You and your baby would never have to worry about money again." For a brief, exhausted moment, surrounded by medical bills and the emotional weight of the past weeks, Jasmine felt the pull of how easy it would be to simply take the offer and disappear from public attention. But as she looked into Marcus's eyes, she saw no real understanding of what he had done, only frustration that his money hadn't yet fixed the problem the way it always had before. She thought of her son, of the example she wanted to set for him, and of every patient she had ever cared for who deserved dignity regardless of their bank account. Slowly, she closed the folder and slid it back across the table. "This isn't about money," she said quietly, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "It never was." Marcus's practiced calm cracked for just a second, revealing something colder beneath. And in that instant, Jasmine realized her rejection had just made things far more dangerous. Furious at being refused, Marcus abandoned any pretense of remorse and shifted into damage control through intimidation instead. He instructed his legal team to file a baseless countersuit against Jasmine, accusing her of provoking the confrontation and damaging his reputation through false narratives, hoping the financial burden of a legal battle would crush her resolve. News of the countersuit spread quickly, and for a moment public opinion wavered, with some outlets questioning whether the story truly was as one-sided as it first appeared. Jasmine felt the ground shift beneath her again, the exhaustion of pregnancy now compounded by the terrifying possibility of a prolonged legal war against a man with unlimited resources. Darius, watching the countersuit unfold, finally decided it was time to stop working quietly in the shadows and reveal the full extent of what he had uncovered. He arranged a private meeting with a respected, independent journalist known for exposing corporate corruption, someone with no ties to Marcus's circle of influence. Over several hours, Darius laid out documented evidence. Financial irregularities connected to Marcus's company, the buried history of the Blackwell family's past fraud, and a pattern of intimidation used against employees and now against Jasmine. The journalist, stunned by the scope of it, asked Darius directly why he had access to such sensitive, carefully guarded information. Darius paused for a long moment before answering, choosing his words with the same careful precision he used in every high-stakes negotiation. "Because uncovering exactly this kind of corruption is what I do," he said simply. "And because this time it's personal." The journalist began preparing a detailed exposé, promising it would be airtight, fact-checked, and impossible to dismiss as mere rumor. Marcus, confident his legal threats would silence the Carter family into submission, had no idea that within days, the full truth of his family's history and his own cruelty was about to be laid bare for the entire world to see. The exposé published 2 weeks later, and its impact was immediate and seismic. Detailed, meticulously sourced, and impossible to ignore, it laid out not only the hospital slap, but the buried fraud connected to Marcus's family fortune, the silencing of a young analyst years earlier, and a disturbing pattern of behavior toward employees who dared to challenge him. Business partners who had hesitated before now severed ties completely, unwilling to be associated with the mounting scandal. Marcus's stock holdings tumbled within hours of the article's release, and for the first time, the billionaire understood with sickening clarity that his name, the very thing he had always relied on, was now actively working against him. Stripped of his usual sense of control, Marcus retreated to his penthouse, refusing calls, watching his carefully built empire crack apart screen by screen. In a rare moment of vulnerable honesty, alone and unable to charm his way out of the consequences closing in around him, he finally allowed himself to remember the moment he struck Jasmine, not as a forgettable inconvenience, but as the spark that had ignited everything now collapsing around him. For the first time in years, something resembling genuine fear crept into his chest, followed slowly, painfully, by something even more unfamiliar: shame. Across the city, Jasmine sat in her living room, scrolling through the article with trembling hands, finally understanding the full scope of what her brother had quietly built and sacrificed to protect her. She felt no triumphant joy, only a heavy, complicated relief, knowing the truth was finally visible to the world, even as she mourned how much pain had been required to get there. As she set down her phone, her doctor's earlier warning echoed in her mind. Stress was dangerous this late in pregnancy, and almost as if her body had been waiting for this exact moment of release, she felt a sudden, sharp tightening across her abdomen that made her gasp aloud. The contraction hit again moments later, stronger and closer than the first, and Jasmine immediately recognized the unmistakable signs of early labor arriving far sooner than expected. Panic flickered through her, not just for herself but for her baby, still weeks away from his due date. She called Darius with a trembling voice, and within minutes he was speeding through the city, breaking every careful, controlled habit he usually maintained, driven purely by fear for his sister and the nephew he had not yet met. By the time he arrived, paramedics were already helping Jasmine into an ambulance, her face pale, her hands clutching her belly as she tried to breathe through escalating pain. At the hospital, doctors worked quickly, monitoring both Jasmine and the baby closely, their voices calm but clipped in the practiced rhythm of people trained for emergencies. Darius paced outside the delivery room, helplessness gripping him in a way that no boardroom confrontation or corporate investigation ever had. He thought of their parents, of the promise he made long ago to protect his little sister no matter what, and prayed silently, fiercely, that this premature arrival would not become another tragedy layered onto an already painful year. Nurses who had once worked alongside Jasmine gathered quietly nearby, their earlier fear of hospital politics replaced entirely by genuine concern for a colleague they deeply respected. After hours that felt like an eternity, a thin, determined cry finally broke through the tense silence of the hallway. Darius's breath caught as a nurse stepped out, smiling exhaustedly, confirming that Jasmine and her baby boy were both stable, both strong despite the early arrival. Relief crashed over him so suddenly that his usually composed exterior cracked, tears slipping down his face as he finally allowed himself to feel everything he had been suppressing for weeks. But even as joy filled the hallway, an unexpected visitor was making his way toward the hospital entrance, someone whose presence would soon turn this fragile, healing moment into a confrontation no one was prepared for. Marcus Blackwell arrived at the hospital unannounced, having learned through a worried associate that Jasmine had gone into early labor following the publication of the exposé. Whether driven by guilt, desperation, or some twisted hope of controlling the narrative once more, he made his way toward the maternity wing, his presence immediately drawing tense, disbelieving stares from staff who recognized him instantly. Security moved quickly to intercept him, but Marcus held up his hands, his voice quieter and more uncertain than anyone had ever heard it. "I just need 5 minutes," he said. "Please." Darius stepped into the hallway the moment he heard Marcus's voice, his earlier tears replaced instantly by a cold, controlled fury that made even the security guards instinctively step back. For the first time, Marcus found himself standing face to face with the man who had quietly dismantled his empire piece by piece, and something in Darius's calm, unwavering gaze made Marcus's earlier arrogance crumble entirely. "You have no right to be here," Darius said evenly, every word measured and deliberate. "Not after what you did. Not today." Marcus, stripped of his usual defenses, did something almost unthinkable. He apologized, not as a performance for cameras or a strategy for damage control, but quietly, brokenly, admitting that he had spent his entire life believing wealth excused cruelty, and that watching his world collapse had finally forced him to see the truth of what he'd become. Darius listened without softening, unmoved by words after everything his sister had endured. "An apology means nothing without change," Darius said finally. And you're about to learn that the hard way. Behind him, through the slightly open door, Jasmine watched the exchange silently, her newborn son resting against her chest, wondering what consequence her brother had been planning all along. One that was about to be revealed to everyone. In the weeks that followed, the full extent of Darius's plan finally came into focus, far more strategic and far-reaching than even Jasmine had imagined. Rather than seeking simple revenge, Darius had spent months quietly coordinating with regulatory investigators, former employees harmed by the Blackwell family's past fraud, and financial watchdog organizations, building a case so thorough that Marcus's legal team had no realistic path to dismiss it. Formal charges related to the historical financial fraud were filed, alongside a separate, well-documented civil case concerning the assault on Jasmine, supported by video evidence, witness testimony, and the hospital's own previously buried security footage, now subpoenaed and impossible to suppress. Philip Donnelly, fearing the hospital's own complicity might surface publicly, made a desperate decision to cooperate fully with investigators, providing internal documents that revealed how administration had initially pressured staff to protect Marcus rather than Jasmine. The revelation sparked outrage not just toward Marcus, but toward the broader pattern of institutions prioritizing wealth over basic human dignity. Hospital leadership faced its own reckoning, issuing public apologies and implementing new policies to protect staff from similar situations in the future. A small but meaningful victory born directly from Jasmine's painful experience. Marcus, watching the case against him grow undeniable, finally accepted that no amount of money or charm could undo the consequences of his actions. Stripped of much of his fortune through settlements, fines, and plummeting business value, he faced the humiliating reality of starting over from a position of accountability rather than entitlement for the first time in his life. Yet even as justice unfolded steadily around him, Jasmine found herself wrestling with unexpected emotions of her own. Not vengeful satisfaction, but a quiet, complicated exhaustion, wondering if she would ever feel truly safe and whole again after everything she had endured. As the legal proceedings concluded, Jasmine slowly began rebuilding a sense of normalcy, though it looked different than the life she'd known before. She took an extended leave from nursing to focus on healing and bonding with her newborn son, whom she named Elijah, a quiet tribute to strength found through hardship. Darius visited often, no longer hiding behind vague explanations about his work, finally sharing more openly with his sister about the path his life had taken and the old wounds that had silently shaped his choices. Their bond, already strong, deepened into something even more profound, built now on complete honesty rather than protective secrecy. Patrice, humbled by the public backlash from her earlier betrayal and genuinely remorseful once she saw the toll it had taken on her cousin, reached out cautiously, hoping for forgiveness she wasn't certain she deserved. Jasmine, exhausted by anger and eager to model grace for her son rather than bitterness, agreed to a slow, honest conversation rather than immediate reconciliation. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a beginning, proof that even fractured family bonds could be mended through patience, accountability, and genuine effort rather than convenient excuses. Meanwhile, news arrived that Marcus, in an unexpected turn following months of public disgrace and quiet reflection, had begun directing a portion of his remaining resources toward funding maternal health care programs and worker protection initiatives. A clumsy, imperfect attempt at atonement rather than a redemption arc anyone fully trusted yet. Jasmine felt no obligation to forgive him, nor did she owe him closure, but she allowed herself a small, private moment of recognition that perhaps real consequences, not wealth, were the only thing that had ever truly had the power to change him. Still, an unresolved question lingered in the back of her mind, one that would soon resurface in a way she never anticipated. Months later, Jasmine received an unexpected invitation to speak at a small, regional gathering of healthcare workers focused on workplace dignity and patient advocacy, organized quietly by former colleagues inspired by her resilience. Hesitant at first, unsure if she was ready to revisit such a painful chapter publicly, she eventually agreed, encouraged by Darius's gentle reminder that her story had already helped change hospital policies and inspired other workers to speak up against mistreatment. Standing before a room of nurses, doctors, and support staff, Jasmine spoke not with anger, but with steady, hard-earned clarity about dignity, resilience, and the importance of protecting those who dedicate their lives to caring for others. In the audience, unknown to her until the very end of her talk, sat a representative from a national nursing advocacy organization, deeply moved by her story and eager to formally recognize her courage. After her speech, Jasmine was approached and offered a meaningful new role helping shape workplace protection policies across multiple hospital networks, a position that would allow her to transform her painful experience into lasting, structural change for healthcare workers everywhere. Overwhelmed with emotion, she accepted, recognizing it as a powerful, unexpected path forward that honored both her resilience and her son's future. That evening, surrounded by family for a quiet celebratory dinner, Jasmine looked around the table at Darius, now finally relaxed and unguarded around the people he loved most, at Patrice, slowly rebuilding trust through consistent effort, and at baby Elijah, sleeping peacefully in his carrier, unaware of the storm that had surrounded his arrival into the world. For the first time in months, Jasmine felt something settle deeply within her chest, something that finally resembled peace rather than mere survival. Yet she couldn't help wondering, as she glanced toward the window and the city lights beyond, whether life still had one final twist waiting just around the corner. A year passed, marked by gradual healing, professional growth, and the quiet rebuilding of trust within the Carter family. Jasmine thrived in her new advocacy role, successfully helping implement updated protections for healthcare workers across several hospital networks, ensuring that what happened to her would be far less likely to happen to others without serious consequences. Elijah grew into a bright, curious toddler, surrounded by a family that had been tested by betrayal and hardship, but had emerged closer and more honest than ever before. Darius, finally allowing himself space outside his demanding work, became a devoted, ever-present uncle, often teasing that Elijah's stubbornness clearly came from his mother's side of the family. Marcus Blackwell, stripped of much of his former empire, lived a dramatically smaller, quieter life, working diligently behind the scenes of the very maternal healthcare initiatives he had begun funding, no longer seeking headlines or admiration, but genuine, unglamorous redemption. He never fully repaired his public reputation, nor did he expect to, but those who worked alongside him noted a humility that hadn't existed before, a man finally confronting the consequences of unchecked privilege rather than hiding behind it. Jasmine never sought a relationship with him beyond what justice had already required, content knowing that real accountability, however imperfect, had ultimately taken root. On a warm evening filled with laughter, Jasmine stood in her backyard watching Elijah chase fireflies while Darius grilled nearby and Patrice helped set the table, finally, fully part of the family again. She thought back to the hallway, the slap, the smile Marcus wore as he walked away believing he was untouchable, and she realized how far that single, painful moment had carried her, through heartbreak, betrayal, fear, and finally, hard-won peace. As she watched her son's joyful laughter fill the evening air, surrounded by the people who had fought for her, stood beside her, and helped her rebuild everything that mattered, Jasmine finally understood that the story had never truly been about what Marcus took from her. It had always been about what she, and the family who loved her, had refused to let him destroy.